You carry within you a force that overturns every prediction, every strategy designed to restrain you. While others scramble to maintain control, bewildered by the unraveling of their carefully guarded schemes, you are rising with clarity and direction. The collapse they face is not your downfall, it is their awakening to the truth that no calculation of theirs can outmatch the unseen strength guiding your steps. The moment that once seemed like their advantage has flipped, leaving them stranded in confusion. Their once celebrated certainty has turned brittle, breaking apart under the weight of reality. What was built to intimidate you is now crumbling before their own eyes, and the silence that follows their failure only amplifies the sound of your ascent. What they mistook for dominance was only borrowed time, and now that borrowed time has run out. Their pride, once polished and sharp, now cuts only themselves. And while they wander through the dust of their own defeat, you are walking into a horizon that they cannot touch, one lit with possibilities they never imagined you would see. Every breath you take now is proof that resistance was never futile, it was purposeful. The setbacks, the trials, the whispers of doubt, they were all signals of the pressure building, not against you, but against them. And that pressure has finally snapped the chains they thought were permanent. The trembling in their hands is not yours to carry, it is their recognition that what was meant to block you has instead paved your path. They look upon what they called power and see nothing but fragments. You look ahead and see the open space of destiny calling you forward. The narrative they tried to write for you has been overturned, ink spilling from the very pen they gripped so tightly. What was once their story is dissolving, and in its place, a new script is unfolding, one authored by resilience, sharpened by vision, and sealed by the kind of courage they could never counterfeit. This is not merely survival, it is transformation. The chaos that drowns them becomes the rhythm that propels you. Where their voices falter, yours gains strength. Where their structures collapse, your foundation deepens. You are not just standing, you are ascending, and the summit ahead is one only you were chosen to claim. You are the kind of soul that was never meant to be steered by the illusions of others. They convinced themselves they were leading the charge, that they were pulling the strings with flawless precision. But now the realization cuts through them with brutal clarity. The reins they clutched so proudly were never theirs to hold, and the ground they thought secure has dissolved beneath their feet. What appeared to them as strength was nothing but a borrowed mask, and behind it was a force they couldn't comprehend guiding their every step toward collapse. They mistook their borrowed momentum for mastery, blind to the truth that the direction was never set by their will. In chasing you, they followed a path already marked for ruin, and now the fallout makes it undeniable. The illusion of authority they once boasted of has dissolved into nothing more than scattered ashes. They were never architects of their journey, only passengers carried toward an inevitable downfall. The control they bragged about was a mirage shimmering in the distance, vanishing the moment they tried to grasp it. What they thought was triumph has revealed itself as self-destruction. This moment of unraveling was not sudden, it was woven from the very beginning. Every choice they celebrated as clever was quietly laced with consequence. Each step they took, thinking they were closing in, was in fact a descent into the abyss waiting just beyond their sight. Now they stand at the edge of what they once called victory, and all that surrounds them is ruin. But before the unraveling came the setup, and in tracing it back, the truth becomes clear. Their pursuit was never a pursuit of you alone, it was a confrontation with a higher design stitched into your existence. The stage had been set long before they ever arrived, and the outcome was decided by a strength that no opposition could bend. Their downfall was not an accident, it was the inevitable outcome of clashing with a current far greater than themselves. The very energy they tried to wield has turned against them, leaving them exposed in their own emptiness. Their intentions, once cloaked in confidence, now echo as hollow failures. What they thought unstoppable has stopped dead in its tracks. And here you remain, not broken, not diminished, but standing with greater clarity than ever before. Their collapse only amplifies the brilliance of your survival, proof that no counterfeit power can withstand the weight of destiny. While they stumble in disbelief, you rise with certainty, carrying the unshakable truth that the journey was never theirs to control, it was always leading back to the strength that flows through you. You were never chosen at random, and that is why the storm against you has been so precise. The opposition did not waste energy scattering its efforts in every direction. It studied, it calculated, and it marked out the weakest links in the chain around you. It sought those already carrying hidden fractures in their hearts, those unsettled by your rise, those uneasy in the glow of your progress. The first signs were subtle, barely noticeable to the eye, like faint ripples on still water. Small thoughts of comparison, quiet feelings of discontent, fragile grudges left unresolved, these became entry points. The opposition knew exactly where to press, who would listen, and who would bend when the weight grew heavy. And so the shadows found their way into familiar faces and familiar places. Every name was chosen with intention, not accident. These were the ones who had watched your steps with a concealed bitterness, who had smiled while wrestling their own envy, who had measured their own stagnation against your growth and despised the reflection it showed them. That inner weakness called out louder than words ever could, and it was answered. The enemy did not bother creating new wounds, that would have taken too much effort. Instead, it magnified the fractures already present. What was once a fleeting thought of comparison became a restless fixation. What was once a quiet doubt began to roar until it drowned out reason. The small seeds were never neutral, they were waiting for the right voice to water them. A single sigh of envy became a storm of accusations. A glance that once carried only discomfort turned into a gaze filled with hostility. The whispers were not foreign, they were simply an echo of what was already buried deep inside, given permission to grow louder, stronger, and more destructive than ever before. What had been contained for years now erupted. The insecurity that told them they could never match your courage swelled into a relentless obsession. The discontent that flickered faintly became a blaze that consumed their judgment. They did not realize that what they embraced was not their own strength but the manipulation of what was always hiding beneath the surface. And so the plot was built not out of fresh schemes but from the hidden corners of fragile hearts. It was never about planting new corruption but about amplifying what already lay dormant. What was once small enough to ignore became too loud to silence, and what was once a passing feeling grew into a force that sought to bring you down, only to expose the weakness in them all along. You have always stood as a mirror that exposed the unspoken hunger in others, and that is why the traps laid against you were dressed so carefully. The schemes did not arrive in rough disguises, they arrived polished, precise, shaped to match the very cravings each heart could not deny. Some were drawn by glittering rewards, others by recognition they longed for but never earned, and still others by the bitter desire to see your light dimmed so their shadows could feel larger. Each invitation was custom-built, tailored like a garment that fit perfectly over the fractures of their souls. The bait was never random, it was measured and calculated to stir the secret longings already whispering inside them. What seemed like opportunity was in truth nothing but a hook, glistening with false promise, waiting for the moment they would bite. Those who envied wealth were shown treasures that seemed to gleam endlessly. Those intoxicated by ambition were enticed with crowns of influence that sparkled in their imagination. And those consumed with bitterness were handed the illusion of vindication, the thrill of tearing someone down under the guise of justice. Every offer felt like destiny calling, yet it was deception singing softly to their pride. But hidden within every glittering offer was a cost, a weight unseen by eyes clouded with obsession. The fine threads woven into those temptations were invisible to those too eager to claim them. What looked like freedom was actually a leash. What felt like triumph was the tightening of chains disguised as gifts. They rushed forward without pause, too eager to savor the promise to notice the hidden exchange taking place. Their desire was louder than wisdom, and in that noise, they failed to see what was slipping through their grasp. The very authority they believed they were gaining was silently draining from them, siphoned away into hands that would use it to enslave them further. Every handshake they imagined as victory was, in reality, the sealing of their own captivity. The power they believed they had secured dissolved into emptiness, leaving them weaker than before. They thought they were taking control, but instead they were surrendering it piece by piece, blinded by the shimmer of lies. And as they celebrated what they thought was conquest, they had already been conquered. The promises that lured them became prisons, the choices they embraced became their undoing, and the control they reached for slipped forever from their grasp. They thought they were writing your ending, but unknowingly, they were scripting the collapse of their own. There is something undeniable about your path that has always been recognized by forces greater and darker than you imagined. From the beginning, the opposition understood it could never truly dismantle you, because your covering was beyond reach. Attempts have been made countless times against souls like yours, and each attempt has ended in futility. The mark upon you was clear, untouchable, immovable, shielded. Yet still, they moved forward with their plans, not in hope of victory, but for a deeper and darker curiosity. Their persistence was never about winning, it was about gathering fragments of knowledge. They were not hunting for triumph, they were running experiments, probing for cracks that did not exist. Your adversaries were never warriors in any real sense, they were test subjects, unwitting participants in trials designed to measure how power responds when challenged. They were being used as tools, and in their blindness, they mistook themselves for conquerors. The schemes were doomed before they began. What the enemy desired was not your downfall, but the spectacle of watching those who opposed you unravel under the weight of their own choices. Their arrogance was not a strength, but a variable in an experiment they did not realize they had signed up for. Their role was never to overthrow you, it was to collapse under the pressure of striking at one who cannot be struck. And so the plans were launched with great confidence. Hidden plots were set in motion. Conversations turned into traps. Resources were exchanged in secret, and strategies were executed in the dark. Each believed they had discovered the perfect method to unravel you. Each believed they were clever enough to bypass the unseen covering around your life. Some took aim at your connections, hoping to fracture bonds they could never truly touch. Others attempted to tarnish your name, thinking lies could erase truth. A few stepped boldly into spaces they had no authority to occupy, convinced they could hold back what was destined to flow freely into your life. Every one of them, in their own way, overestimated themselves and underestimated the power that surrounded you. The irony is that every strike became a reflection of their own weakness. What they unleashed was not harm to you but exposure of themselves. Their efforts did not break your protection, they broke the illusion that they were ever in control. The traps they built became cages for their own spirits, locking them into the very downfall they imagined for you. And through it all, you remained untouchable. Their rage only confirmed your resilience. Their collapse only magnified your elevation. They were never soldiers in a war against you, they were examples written into a larger story, illustrating that no force of darkness can overturn what has been set apart for a higher purpose. Their defeat was inevitable, and their failure has only strengthened the light that surrounds you. What they never expected was the rebound, the way every strike turned against them with uncanny accuracy. The harm they designed refused to touch you, instead, it recoiled like a weapon misfired in their own hands. Every snare they crafted became their prison. Every attempt to close off your advancement birthed new openings in directions they could not foresee. You continued to rise, untouched, as though shielded by an unseen current carrying you higher. At the same time, an unraveling began within their own lives, so precise it could never be dismissed as coincidence. Carefully laid plans disintegrated. Promises that seemed certain dissolved. Bonds they thought unshakable began splintering without clear cause. Finances that once flowed freely became blocked. This was no accident. It was the consequence of pledging themselves to a system that demands repayment in the most devastating ways. The truth is that bargains with darkness are never one-sided. Every agreement carries collateral, and the collateral is the very essence of life's blessings. By joining that pact, they placed all their protection, all their fortune, and all their joy on the line. And when the collector came, he left nothing overlooked, calculating every ounce of debt with ruthless precision. Yet the damage went deeper than material loss. Their decision turned them into conduits for shadows, living transmitters of destruction that broadcast unrest into every corner of their existence. They became magnets for negativity, drawing storms of discord into their homes, their relationships, their futures. By allowing corruption to flow through them, they became vessels of the same force that devoured them. It spread like contamination, subtle at first, then undeniable. Children bore the weight of turmoil that wasn't theirs. Partnerships withered under invisible strain. Peace became impossible in any environment they touched. This was not just the loss of opportunity, it was the steady poisoning of everything good they once held close, all consumed as part of the bargain they thought would elevate them. Still, some clung to false reasoning, convincing themselves it was only a passing cost. They believed normalcy would return once their schemes succeeded. But they failed to understand the permanence of their choice. There is no clause for restoration in the contracts of destruction, no exit route back to safety once authority has been surrendered. What they considered temporary was in fact eternal. They weren't participants in a short mission, they had become bound servants, tied to a system that never returns what it takes. Their downfall was not only predictable, it was irreversible. And all the while, your unshaken assent stood as the living proof that their surrender to darkness was nothing but their own undoing. They carried themselves as if they were untouchable, but the cracks in their armor began widening faster than they could cover them. What they launched against you refused to land, yet the cost of their choices still demanded payment. The more they pushed against the shield surrounding your life, the more they discovered that their own strength, health, and stability were slipping away. Their vitality drained, their resources evaporated, and the very connections that once supported them turned brittle and broke. The unraveling wore the disguise of random chance. A sudden misstep, an unexpected setback, an illness that appeared without warning, each event seemed ordinary when viewed alone. But string them together and a chilling pattern emerged. Their downfall wasn't chaos, it was consequence. They had walked into a mechanism designed to grind down everything they touched, and the harder they fought to escape, the deeper they sank into its relentless pull. You, however, carried something they lacked, a clarity that cannot be purchased or faked. Long before words were spoken or actions revealed, your spirit recognized the dissonance in their presence. The unease you felt was not suspicion, it was the warning signal of protection woven into your path. You recoiled instinctively, as if your very being understood that lingering too close to them would poison what you were building. Your distance unsettled them. They mistook your withdrawal for pride, as though you believed yourself above them. What they could not comprehend was that you were not pulling away out of superiority, but because you were being shielded from contamination. Light cannot mix with shadows without being dimmed, and the separation was not a choice, it was inevitability, the natural rejection of what carried corruption. This unseen discernment haunted them, because you always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. They were unsettled by how you anticipated betrayals before they happened, how you sidestepped traps they thought were invisible, how you released ties before disloyalty could cut you. To their bewildered minds, it seemed you had inside knowledge, But in reality, it was divine foresight revealing their plans before they ever touched you. Watching you continue to thrive became its own torment. Day after day, they had to face the undeniable. While their efforts dissolved, your steps remained steady, your joy remained intact, your progress only accelerated. Each moment of your victory echoed like a reminder of their futility. Their frustration deepened as they realized their own losses mounted faster than your successes could be counted. And then the truth finally surfaced with cruel clarity. The schemes were never designed to succeed in the first place. They weren't chosen to topple you, they were baited into dismantling themselves. Their hatred became the tool of their undoing, their obsession the very fuel that powered their collapse. The enemy had never promised them triumph, he had only promised destruction. They weren't destroying you, they were devouring themselves. They were certain persistence would crack the shield around you, yet every attempt only deepened their bewilderment. Their strategies, though intricate, collapsed under invisible weight. Confusion gave way to desperation, and desperation gave way to recklessness. The more they pressed, the harder the consequences recoiled on them, leaving them scrambling to make sense of why their energy spent against you only multiplied their own ruin. Convinced they simply needed to intensify their efforts, they funneled more time, more resources, more alliances into their schemes. But every additional person drawn into their cause became another spark of chaos. Allies who lent their voices to slander soon found their own reputations eroding. Relatives who played along with betrayal felt their own households fracture. Associates who tampered with your progress discovered their own professional ladders collapsing beneath them. What they thought was power in numbers was really multiplication of debt. The snare grew heavier with every recruit. Each agreement was like handing over another brick of authority to the very force orchestrating their downfall. It was as if every conspirator became a new account opened in the enemy's name, each one accruing interest that demanded repayment in destruction. What they mistook for collective strength was nothing but collective collapse, each bound to the other in spirals of loss. When their ordinary weapons failed, some wandered into territories they once mocked. They whispered incantations, sought forbidden practices, invoked forces they did not understand, convinced that shadows could be commanded like pets. But those shadows were not allies, they were debt collectors. And each ritual only etched their names deeper into ledgers of ruin, speeding up the collapse of everything they once valued. Others believed themselves clever enough to beat destiny at its own game. They thought observation and strategy could compensate for the lack of spiritual authority. They charted your movements, analyzed your choices, tried to corner you through logic and manipulation. But the more elaborate their blueprints became, the faster they unraveled. For they were playing chess on a board that belonged to someone else, where every move had already been anticipated. Their arrogance blinded them to the scale of what they were fighting. They thought your resilience was personal skill, something that could be dissected and countered. They never realized it was divine wisdom flowing through you, a current no human effort could redirect. Attempting to dismantle that protection was like trying to smother the horizon with a blanket, futile, absurd, doomed from the start. In the end, every path they chose led back to the same revelation. The very thing they thought they could overcome was immovable. Their alliances dissolved, their rituals betrayed them, their strategies backfired. And as their collapse accelerated, the lesson carved itself deeper with every failed strike. They had never been capable of defeating you, because the battle was never theirs to win. They reached the point where panic overtook pride. Watching their world unravel while yours expanded drove them into frantic attempts to undo what had been set in motion. Some tried to backpedal, convinced they could simply walk away from the darkness they had welcomed. They did not understand that there are no reversals in those kinds of agreements. Once the ink is sealed in spirit, there is no cancellation clause. Others doubled down, escalating to even greater extremes in hopes that greater force would reverse their fate. But revelation eventually settled in, heavy and suffocating. The truth struck them with merciless clarity. They had never been soldiers in a battle, they had been fodder in an experiment. They weren't generals commanding attacks, they were participants in their own undoing. They had offered themselves up for demolition, and destruction came with mechanical precision, leaving nothing untouched. The exposure was devastating. Surrounded by fragments of the life they once valued, they could no longer escape the reality staring them in the face. The alluring promises whispered to them earlier dissolved into nothingness. Rewards they were assured of never appeared. What remained was the bitter knowledge that they had paid dearly for their downfall, handing over their futures in exchange for illusions. Even more crushing was the recognition of what their fixation on you had truly meant. In their most honest moments, they remembered the role you once played in their lives, not as an enemy, but as a figure whose growth unsettled them. You had done nothing but choose expansion beyond the limits they had accepted. That decision, however, stirred a darkness in them they could no longer control. Your very progress became a living mirror to them. Each achievement illuminated the stagnation they had refused to leave behind. Each choice you made to guard your peace revealed the boundaries they lacked the courage to draw. Every new blessing in your life reflected back the blessings they had squandered or sabotaged. Your light didn't create their shadows, it simply revealed them, and that revelation became unbearable. This is why your act of stepping away from what no longer served you was interpreted as betrayal. What you intended as preservation of your path, they viewed as rejection of their identity. They mistook self-respect for contempt. Your ability to release what wasn't meant for you highlighted their inability to do the same, and that contrast felt like a direct assault on their very sense of worth. And so their bitterness twisted perception. They saw your rise as abandonment, your boundaries as insults, your success as theft. They never grasped that your elevation created space for their own if they had chosen to follow a similar path. Instead of learning from your ascent, they chose to fight against it. The outcome was inevitable. They sank deeper into ruin while you continued climbing beyond their reach, leaving them behind in the wreckage of their own choices.